All right, I see we have some folks popping in here. So good morning, everyone. Excited to get this webinar started, talking about decarbonization and sustainability. Probably going to give it one more minute to let more folks register and get in. But we'll kind of start with some general announcements and kind of an overview. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. My name is Bret Elam with OnIndus. And with me today, I have Anil and Richie, and we'll go into introductions here in a moment. But just sort of some housekeeping items. So, everyone will be on mute kind of by default. We will try to keep to the time as best we can. Please utilize the chat for questions and comments. I did put a form in there as a survey form. We want to get everyone to fill out afterwards as well, but we'll be monitoring the chat and try to ask questions as we go. We want this to be engaging. The webinar is being recorded, and we will send a PDF of all the slides and materials out afterwards. If for some reason we don't get to anything, specific question that comes up that we really want to make sure we answer, we'll try to send that question and answer out at the end as well. All right. So a little bit about our speakers today. So as I said, I'm Bret, an advisor with OnIndus, and we have Anil Sawhney, who's the head of sustainability for the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. Anil's going to kind of kick us off today talking, high level, more global picture about sustainability, decarbonization. And then we have Richie Stever, who's the vice president of real estate and construction at the University of Maryland Medical System. And he's going to talk a little bit more about, their healthcare system and things they're doing at the regional level, and kind of do some case studies about challenges they're seeing and things that they're working on. So I will ask right away. I see we have someone who's already done this, so appreciate that. Is just let us know who you are and where you are in the world. If you could do that in the chat, we just kind of get a sense of who's here and where you're located from, and we really appreciate that. So I'm going to go ahead and a little bit about OnIndus. So we're a construction technology firm, do a lot of work in the technology space, but also the operation space within capital programs and improvement teams. You can see some of the offerings we have here. Partner with folks like Richie and other healthcare organizations to, write procedures, playbooks, do technology work. So without further ado here, because I know we want to get to everyone, all the great content we have, and we got folks from all over the world. I see Denver, Ohio, and a few other folks. So good morning, Wyatt. Good to see you from Whiting Turner. So I'm going to turn it over to Anil and get started.
Thank you very much, Bret. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks, OnIndus, for putting this webinar together. And those who have joined, appreciate your time. Hopefully, you'll find the session useful. So what we have done is we've given sort of two presentations, very quick ones. One which will cover high-level information on sustainability, decarbonization as a sector, the regulatory landscape, target setting and reporting requirements. And then I think, as OnIndus slide that you just saw, it's really about data and information management and digital tools at the end of the day. So those are the three items I'll cover. I'll move to the next slide to give you a big picture of where I'm coming from. I think carbon right now is the loudest voice, but not the only voice in the built environment sector. Here I try to give you a picture of what we really, when we deliver projects and manage, operate our assets, this is the big picture of what we are talking about when we say sustainability. You all have heard of environmental, economic, social aspects of our projects and assets, but what does that really mean? What's the framework? What's the detail behind when we say environmental, economic, social? You can see there are two further layers which get into a lot of detail, because ultimately it's about measuring, reporting, and improving. If it's carbon, which actually on the rightmost list, long list, which is probably not readable, you will see one of the measurements, reporting and improvement requirements, is global warming potential, or GWP, topic of our discussion today. But then there are a whole host of things that we must measure, report, and improve that comes through data and information. And actually, it's really not about carbon counting. It's much bigger than that. And that's where I think Richie brings that case study, a very large portfolio of assets, how this really translates into the real world. But it's important that we start from this framework. I've taken this from the ISO 21929, which gives you, as built environment professionals, a long list of metrics that you can measure, report, and improve on your projects. For example, life cycle costs, job creation from a social aspect, and other impacts that our projects and assets have on communities. So moving on to the next slide, we're going to go a little bit deeper into carbon emissions because that's top of the mind. And you must have seen these numbers being floated around. The impact of our sector globally at a sector level, these are top-down estimates. These are not bottom-up estimates, meaning we don't look at projects and assets individually, just as a sector in the economy, how much emissions come from our sector. And the number varies between 37 to 43%. This is a report from 2022. So really, these are 2021 numbers. About 40%, 43% of emissions come from buildings and infrastructure. So buildings, residential, non-residential, and infra. So broadly, when we say carbon emissions, our focus so far has been on operational energy and operational carbon. We've really become very good at managing the operational carbon. But I think the conversation needs to grow because carbon emissions, what is locked into a building during construction, all the concrete, steel, and other products and materials used also must be accounted for. And that's called embodied carbon. The embodied carbon itself is about roughly 15% right now. So it's therefore crucial to take the whole of life carbon emissions point of view, which includes operational carbon, embodied carbon, user carbon, and then there are some benefits and loads beyond system boundary. When you bring down an asset, there is going to be some carbon emissions that will take place. And if you do circularity or reuse some of the products, materials, and components, you will get some benefits because that's literally taking the embodied carbon and pushing it to a next asset or project that you're building. So the point of this slide is we make a big impact. Decarbonization of the economy would not take place without really paying attention to the built environment sector. So we, all of us as a profession, have a significant influence on this. And lastly, pay attention to operational carbon, but also keep in mind embodied carbon. And then there is this aspect of user carbon, which I don't think we'll have time to go into, but that's the carbon emitted when our assets are used by the end users. So that's the big picture. Now, how do you measure all this? Sorry for this very complicated modular structure, which is actually borrowed from an ISO standard of 15978 and others, which is essentially showing you the three components that I talked about from a whole life carbon assessment point of view. The block or the module in purple that you see is generally called module A, which is all your upfront embodied carbon. So measuring in the production stage, the transport, the extraction of materials, waste on a construction site, construction assembly, all those emissions go under module A. And then you have module B, which is essentially where in-use embodied carbon and operational carbon, the golden box that you see below the light blue, is accounted for. And then it's very important in some jurisdictions, especially in Europe and UK, are asking at the planning stage when you look for a permit, especially for larger projects, how are you going to deal with end-of-life carbon emissions? The deconstruction strategy, transport, waste disposal, and reuse need to be accounted for. That's called module C. And then the last little bit on the right is the module D, which is those benefits and loads that come out of the system boundary. Lastly, on the bottom, you will see user carbon, which is accounted for separately. The gray boxes in between are for biogenic carbon that needs to be reported separately. So for example, if you use timber on your projects, which has biogenic carbon stored in the wood beam, for example, that needs to be accounted for separately because it's carbon not emitted but stored in the building component. So broadly, when it comes to whole life cycle carbon calculations, this is the framework that we as RICS have provided in a professional standard that's a global standard for whole life carbon assessment. The source link is provided at the bottom. So giving you that big picture, what does this really mean in terms of an actual building? So I've taken this slide from an entity called iStructE, structural engineers out of the UK who've done for a typical residential multifamily kind of a building and given you big chunks of where emissions take place. So far we've been ignoring module A, which is that upfront embodied carbon, but it accounts for roughly for this type of building in this climate, about 50% of the total emissions of an asset. What we have been tinkering with is about 23% of operational carbon, which directly comes from energy use in a building. So if we truly want to decarbonize the sector, we got to bring that 50%, the 4% in transport, about 1% on the construction site, all into the equation. Now, 1% on a construction site may seem very small, but if you bring in some material which has 50% embodied carbon in it and waste it on a site due to rework or any other issues, you would have lost that embodied carbon. So the impact actually is quite higher than 1% if you don't operate in an efficient fashion. So moving along, where are we at? A recent report by the UN shows that the pace and scale of climate action are insufficient to tackle climate change. Now, you may have seen this at COP28 also. If you follow that coming out of Dubai, this figure actually got updated last week. It's not publicly released yet. The gap in where the progress we have made is much wider, actually. So it's more scary. The straight line on the left, dotted line that you see, is the path to having zero carbon building stock. So we started in 2015, and the little circle shows you the progress made, which is then exploded on the right side of the graph. We started off very well, 4.1, 4.2, stayed close to that target, but then we sort of started falling and creating the gap between the target and actual progress of buildings being pretty high. So this is from the Building Performance Institute in Europe that produces this, takes a whole host of factors to come up with this graph. Now, you will notice that there is a gap, but in my view, this is a giant baby step we have already taken towards awareness and towards this issue of reduction. So that's all I want to say on this slide. And as we look forward to moving a little bit closer to what's happening in the US in various states, and I think Richie would have much more to say about what's happening in Maryland. I think Montgomery County, where I live, also has a good progress made, good papers and reports and upcoming regulations. But you will see that the primary focus so far of all these regulations at the state and perhaps jurisdiction level have been primarily energy use intensity factors, but some have started bringing GHG reporting, so especially for certain size buildings, into play. So you will notice that DC, for example, accounts for both the energy use as well as GHG reporting. So many of these benchmarks and policies are going to become mandatory in the next year or by 2025. The focus has been on commercial buildings, on operational carbon, but I think that may change also. So this is a snapshot published by USGBC on what's happening at the state and jurisdiction level. So on the next slide, I'll give you an example of what would happen as soon as certain laws come into play. All of you would have heard of the New York City's local law 97, which is going to require buildings above a certain size to be compliant. They published a benchmark, and anyone who's above that benchmark will pay a fine of $268 per ton of carbon dioxide emitted. Now, this is an industry estimate, so take it with a grain of salt. This may not, if I were to calculate, I don't think the fines are going to be so large, but by some estimates, if we don't do something about this retrofit business, these are for existing buildings, the losses that, or the fines that the buildings could face would be close to $1 billion a year in 2030. That's a pretty large number. And you can see going forward, 2035, 2040, it will go to $1.3 billion. Point being, no longer you can take this issue lightly, especially imagine if you're a multifamily residential building and this law were to apply, how do you get the retrofits in place? So there's, again, very important aspect to consider in certain jurisdictions. And you'll see across the country, buy clean, low carbon concrete and steel regulations coming in fairly rapidly. So on the next slide, those were now jurisdictional targets. But if you are an organization, for example, Richie is probably much more tuned to this, soon you would be required under either ESG reporting or carbon reporting to set targets. So there's an entity called Science-Based Targets Initiative, which helps companies, depending on where they are, to create short-term and long-term targets company-wide across a portfolio of your assets. So if you're a company A and your benchmark, your current state is a bit high, then you follow the sectoral decarbonization approach, or what's called the carbon intensity convergence method, to develop your pathway to decarbonization. So when you report, let's say under the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, or any other disclosure regime, you can utilize these SBTI targets to set targets for your entire portfolio and check from year to year how you're progressing in a target. In this graph, you'll see company C is progressing pretty nicely and may not have to do many cuts, but this is a hypothetical example. So I think on the next slide, I want to make this point. As you probably know, AGC has also launched a task group or a task force on carbon reporting for contractors. You will see that they ran a survey, and there's a lot of detail that you need to collect in order to do decarbonization, especially what I said, report, measure, report, and improve. So it ultimately, as any other initiative in our sector, boils down to data and information management. I think that's where OnIndus probably has a brilliant set of tools that they can help organizations with to focus on data and information. Because if you don't have the data and the information, either through your IoT devices or through a building management system or through on-site monitoring, you would not be able to efficiently fill this information. So you will notice you have to collect on-site fuel use, on-site electric use, gas use, water use, and this is just one sub-module of the bigger modules that I shared with you, focusing on A 5.4, I believe, which is on-site processes during the construction stage. So this is obviously for new builds and retrofits, but if you have running assets, there's much more data that you have to collect. So point on this slide really is focus on data and information management. Then only you can start your decarbonization journey. So moving along, lastly, I think as a sector, I really like this quote. Why not address decarbonization the same way as safety? Safety is not disjointed from our other workflows and work practices. So the Institution of Structural Engineers, IStructE, in 2019, made the commitment to treat sustainability and climate emergency with equal importance as life safety. So when you design a structure, for example, the paramount feature that you're looking for is life safety, the safety of the structure, the safety of the construction workers, and the safety of the occupants when that asset is being used. Why can't we bring that sustainability thinking, whole life thinking, central and core to the production, construction, operation, end of life, and beyond asset life thinking? Meaning, sustainability and decarbonization shouldn't be this separate module sitting here in a fragmented way. They need to be now integrated into our thinking, into our workflow, into our work practices, which again brings us back to the importance of data and information management. So, Bret, I think I have met the timeline requirement. I'm going to pat myself on the back. And
you are on scope and on schedule, my friend. So, okay. No, thank you very much, Anil. Really appreciate that. I see there was a question in the chat that was answered by Leslie. So, Leslie, thank you very much for AGC as the General Contractors Association of America. And one question, Anil, that came up, and it was really part of your earlier slides, was, you mentioned the gap between, sort of where we wanted to be and where we are now. And obviously there's the pandemic factor that was in there as well. So pandemic factor aside, what do you think are the biggest challenges on a global level? And we'll talk to Richie more about a regional level, but on a global level about getting where we are. Is it economics? Is it politics? Is it a combination of factors? What do you think are the key drivers there?
I think there are, obviously, if we start looking at a sort of a pessimistic view, there are several blockers come into mind. So top of the mind for me is skills and competencies, because this is sort of maybe for most of us who are not in the energy efficiency and sustainability's specialism, this is an area that requires a little bit more learning and upgrading our skills. So one of the areas is skills and competencies. Second, I think is more important for me is standards and standard ways of measurement. So if you're going to benchmark, this is not a target that you just manage internally. If it were, let's say, capital cost of a capital program, largely it's going to stay within the stakeholder group. This is something that you have to make transparent and show everyone, all your broader stakeholders, that you're meeting targets. So if you're not measuring using a consistent approach, we may be just comparing apples to oranges and reporting stuff that may not even be accurate. So that's where our global standard on whole life carbon assessment is really the world-leading only standard that provides a broad framework to assess carbon. So really, skills and competencies, standards for calculations, reporting is the next thing. So we have a reporting framework that we produce in which you can report in a consistent fashion. Lastly, I think I'm probably repeating this, data and information management. When you're building a project, you're gathering, collecting so much data. Oftentimes, we don't use that data and information in a meaningful fashion, especially towards sustainability. I know we've become much better in producing digital twins. We have become much better in common data environments, use of BIM, and so on. But I think there's still more room for improvement to become data-centric. So if you don't have data, then it's very difficult to address this issue. And then there are broader economy-wide stuff that's going on. The grid is getting decarbonized. How do we account for that? The material production itself is going to get decarbonized. Cement and steel industries, the supplier side is getting decarbonized through deep decarbonization initiatives. So how do we address and use the best products and materials, all those aspects? It's a pretty a big puzzle in terms of policy, building codes, procurement regime, all of it comes into play. So probably need a separate webinar to address all the issues.
Okay, no, thank you very much for that. And I'd like to ask the audience who's participating here. I'm going to get Richie started on his great story soon, but just let us know in the chat, what are the challenges that you're seeing? Because I know Richie's going to help us talk through what are some of the challenges he's seeing at an organization level and how his team is addressing that. So in the chat, just let us know what challenges you're seeing. We'll kind of see if they line up. And Richie, I may put you on the hot seat with a couple of things that come through and get you to respond to those. So very much appreciate the time, and I'll really appreciate your presentation. So Richie, over to you for our healthcare system case study.
Great job, Anil. Thanks, Bret. So in my presentation, we're going to talk about what sustainability looks like for us, what decarbonization route we're on, and then how we're prioritizing our work and our tactics. And so the next slide. So you might recognize this looks like a honeycomb. That was purposeful. We on 2 of our hospital buildings, we do have real beehives on top of the building. So we're using that theme in several different locations here as we move sustainability forward. And by the way, you know, Bret read my title as VP of Real Estate and Construction, but I also oversee the sustainability platform for the medical system. So I'm glad that I get to sit in both camps, both with construction and sustainability, because one influences the other. And so speaking of influence, you know, this is what our vision is looking forward. So I'm going to start on the left. You know, we want to improve our energy generation at every facility. I'll talk more about that in a minute where we are. We want to improve our greenhouse gas emissions. And when I say that, we're mainly focused today on scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that's the emissions that are generated. Scope 1 is emissions that are generated from the building proper. Scope 2 are essentially the emissions generated to support any utilities that help run the building. And then 3 is all the products and services that you use in a day-to-day basis to keep your building and your not only your building but your core operation going. That's scope 3. So again, we're not focused on scope 3. That's a really heavy lift. We're already finding scope 1 and 2 is heavy enough lift, but I just wanted to be transparent about that. Next, we're looking at to increase our offsite renewable energy. Can you go back, Bret? Yeah. We're looking at water conservation, developing green revolving fund. We're also talking about, I know we're not talking about waste here, but how we manage our trash, cogen plants, which we have some points there, microgrids, other hazardous waste, life cycle cost analysis, because you know many of us in the building trades are looking at first cost analysis, but we really need to start factoring in life cycle cost analysis. So we're endeavoring to do that more. Meeting international laws for purchased goods, and then minimizing our hazardous materials. Right, next one. All right, so what are we doing right now? So as far as building energy efficiency is concerned, we have built LEED certified buildings. We do have a hospital building that's gold certified. Happy to have that. Many of our buildings are required to be green buildings according to local requirements, at least silver as LEED is concerned. Whether we go after those certifications or not depends on finances, but typically we are building to any new buildings to silver standard LEED. We're performing some energy treasure hunts. I'll talk about that later. We are collecting and analyzing efficiency information about building performance and equipment. So that relates to the treasure hunts. Again, I'll talk about that later. As far as renewable powers is concerned, we do have, we are planning, actually the building I'm sitting in right now, planning to install solar canopies on the parking lots, so we can take advantage of that open space. We just purchased on November 1st, we just started infusing 10 megawatts of hydropower into our system that basically covers about 18% of our hospital system's energy. So that's, to give you a scale, that's 13 hospitals and 380 total addresses. So we have a pretty big system, and so we're getting some hydropower there. And then at our big hospital, our biggest facility, 2.1 million square feet, we're adding our 5th cogen. So we have 4 running 2 megawatt cogen plants. That's where we bring in natural gas into a generator. Looks like a big emergency generator, but then the output is what's important. So that a typical generator will produce electricity, but a cogen actually produces electricity and hot water. So by producing the hot water from the cogen, we reduce our heating water expenses, and generally that's natural gas. So that's helpful there. Then as far as waste is concerned, we're talking about trash here. Is we're capturing all the data about our trash, how we're managing that, what kind of waste streams do we have. We're creating a dashboard to track the emissions. And then locally, the state of Maryland, where we are located, has enacted an organics bill for any hospital, or actually any building that produces more than 2,000 tons of waste a year. And so they're requiring us to become more responsible with those waste items, and I'm happy to report that we are. We had to make a little bit of changes with our practices, but now we're collecting food waste not only in the back of the house or in the kitchen, but we're also collecting it post-consumer and sending it out to a reprocessor there. As far as communications concerned, communications are huge, especially as you're looking to get buy-in both internally and externally. Is we have a newsletter that is an email newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks to the 29,000 employees that we have in our system, and we have sustainability topics that we talk about in there. We are developing a performance and accountability report, which basically tracks and trends our history on many things and reports out to the various stakeholders. And then we're in the process of developing a formal sustainability plan. As a matter of fact, the draft of the plan is sitting on the desk and being reviewed by the CEO right now. So hopefully within the next month or so, that sustainability plan, which covers all these items we're talking about, not just energy, but also waste, food, how we're buying things, other things. And then lastly, we created a triad where we bring varying companies in. So we have partners that help us do a lot of these things. So there's on this triad, there are members from an organization that helps us with the way we buy energy. There's another organization that helps us with the way we use energy. And then we have a waste consultant that helps us with how we manage our waste. And we brought all 3 of them together. As you know, these 3 groups don't talk the same language, but we're finding over the course of the last 16 months that we've been together is that they're learning from one another, and they're providing ideas that the other more formal group that understands the topic doesn't necessarily think about. So having the outside eyes on what we're talking about has certainly proven helpful. Next slide. So Anil talked about this a little bit, but I just want to make sure we're all talking the same language. So what is decarbonization? So we're looking at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, both direct emissions and offset emissions. Why? To mitigate climate change and to transition away from fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are generally produced by natural gas, oils, and coal. And then some of the benefits and why we as a health organization are trending towards decarbonization. In addition to the legislation, we were already on the path, just the legislation is pushing us a little faster. It mitigates climate change and improves energy efficiency. There are some economic benefits. There are clearly some health benefits, and then develops our sustainability package. What are the the challenges of decarbonization sometimes are, and I'm going to say sometimes because it's not all the time. Sometimes there's some cost implications. Sometimes there's some limited impact, whether it's practical or not to do this thing that you're thinking about. There's some politics, and then technology is not necessarily keeping up to where the goals are. So sometimes there are not some alternatives out there yet, although we hear many alternatives are being developed. So I just wanted to acknowledge that there are challenges with decarbonization. So as far as legislation, the legislation I'm tracking, so while Anil had a whole list of legislation out there, many of them that he had on his list were proposed. This is a list that I'm following and we're following that are actual. So at the federal level, the Inflation Reduction Act covers new and existing buildings with a near-term goal of 40% reduction by 2030 and a long-term goal of net zero by 2050. Then as we drill down, again, I'm in the state of Maryland, so this one's really particular to me. So any building over 35,000 square foot, new and existing, is requiring a 20% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2040. So even more aggressive in the long-term goal than the federal laws. And then Massachusetts and New York, Anil talked about New York, but we keep these in focus because typically Maryland is about a year or two behind in legislation from these two states. So as a matter of fact, when COVID happened, we were 2 weeks behind COVID results from New York and Massachusetts. So basically what happens in the Northeast trickles down to us right here in the Maryland, DC area. And so we kind of keep our sights on that Northeast corridor there. So what are we doing and how are we prioritizing our efforts? So one is obviously getting C-suite engagement. I talked about that in a minute. I have another example of what we're doing. Offering some creative learning. So helping our constituents understand what's going on, what we're talking about, because a lot of times we talk about decarbonization, electrification, sustainability, and it goes right over people's heads. So making sure that we keep those who we're talking to in the conversation and not talking over their heads. That's really important. And then I'll give you some examples of our journey. So I'm really excited to share those points with you. So as far as C-suite engagement, so we did some treasure hunts. So what I'm saying about a treasure hunt and what I mean about a treasure hunt is we go around our facility, and I'll give you an example at my own house. So I bought a house in February of last year, and when I bought the house, I was walking around. I'm like, what kind of light bulbs do we have in this house? So I found out they were all incandescent. So that was a little bit of a treasure hunt. Guess what I did? I changed the light bulbs to LED. Then I'm looking at the water heater. What's the temperature that the water heater is putting out? So the water heater was putting out 160 degrees. Almost sent somebody to the hospital because it's so hot. But so we turned it down to 120. Are the filters cleaned in the air conditioning units? They weren't. So we cleaned the air filters. What about programmable thermostats? No, there were not programmable thermostats. So we added those. Do we have any air infiltration from the outside? Yes. So we sealed up those gaps. And so we're taking those same philosophies that I just described at the house, and we used them to do some treasure hunts at work. As an example here that was presented to the C-suite, we have 8,000 PCs in our network, and all of them are left on all the time almost, right? And so the idea is if we just put them in sleep mode, right, we can save about $120,000 a year just by putting them into sleep mode. So there's some real easy ways to walk around your buildings and your facilities to just take a different look at the building. So mainly I say, your tools are use your senses and then use your sensors to verify. So most of the time you can walk into a space, as far as temperature is concerned, it feels too hot, too cold. Let's look at the settings there. And there's opportunities all around. Typically, when we walk around as building owners, managers, and operators, we think about cleanliness. We think about, comfortability as far as, are all the chairs there. But if we walk around with a different mindset, looking for opportunities to save energy, they're right in front of you. You just have to get out and do it. And it's actually a fun process. You'll see on the bottom right, the fabulous Team 5 found this particular savings opportunity. But if you make it a game, it becomes real fun. And then so we are crowdsourcing some treasure hunts. So that previous slide was at one of the hospitals. Now we're doing 10 sites, 6 hospitals, 3 MOBs, and 1 emergency department. We're trialing the treasure hunting package and then scale it up and then embed it into regular practice. We are expect to see, and we're already seeing 3% savings per site just by doing these treasure hunts. And then there's opportunity for some rebates to cover any costs you might have. So we do have a little bit of cost with doing this, but the rebates cover it. And then offers the foundation for fault detection, which I'll talk about in a minute. All right, so on our journey, what have we done? So we've, like I did at my house, at the hospitals and the buildings, we've converted to LED bulbs. We've added some heat recovery systems where instead of throwing the heat from the air conditioning system out into the atmosphere, we're actually recovering it to do other things. We do have a solar farm. I mentioned solar canopies here at the corporate office, but we also have a solar farm that we've had for 11 years now, produces electricity for us. We harvest the rainwater. So on our big buildings, particularly the hospitals, we have helipads, so large flat surfaces that helicopters can land on. And we're capturing all that water and using it to either serve as makeup water for the cooling towers or for irrigation for the landscaping, one of those 2 things. One of my newest favorite ones is this last one, cold water humidification. That's what I call it. The official term is adiabatic, but instead of using steam to humidify air, we're using cold water. I'm going to acknowledge it takes a little bit of a special air conditioning unit to use this, but once the air conditioning unit is configured to accept it, it works great. And so what are we thinking about in the future? So we're investigating fault detections and diagnostics. That's a program that overlays on top of the building automation system that looks for problems and anomalies and alerts your facilities team on potential opportunities. The healthcare system just had the opportunity to install microgrids. It's been prohibited in the past, so we're looking at that. How can we install microgrids on our sites? Looking for additional opportunities to add solar. We're building a new building soon, and we're looking at powering or heating both the air and the water with geothermal. So really excited about that piece. And then we're making a conscious effort to move towards all electric buildings. So instead of having those fossil fuels support the building, particularly for heating air and water or humidification, we're looking at going all electric. Now, as healthcare organizations, we still have the requirement to have backup power, which that's either diesel generators or gas powered generators, but we're excluding those pieces in our discussion because that's just for emergencies. And so that's all I had, Brett. I'm certainly here to answer any questions that the audience may have. I'm willing to sit on the hot seat if you'd like, and I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Richie. Really appreciate it. And yeah, one of the questions that came up from Leslie earlier on, and I know, Anil, you addressed this in the chat, but I think it's a good one for both of you to probably weigh in on is, And Anil, maybe I'll start with you since you had an initial answer, is that curious if there's discussion about the financial burden of supporting this work in progress, especially in regards to labor shortages and training sufficiencies, which we know are already issues in construction and a lot of these organizations anyway, right?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, and I think Richie really had it laid out very well with the image, also cost and value. So there will possibly be an incremental cost, but I think the way we currently deal with our, especially construction, and just look at capital cost or initial cost, justification on some of these would be difficult. But especially for large owners, operators like Richie managing such a large portfolio, it makes sense to start looking at a whole of life approach, life cycle costing. If you pay less but lose on energy efficiency and perhaps replacement costs, then the life cycle cost or the total cost of ownership is high. It's easier said than done. So till we start looking at operational carbon, embodied carbon trade-off, and not make decisions just based on one or the other, and similarly combine cost and decarbonization together. And that's where I said we have a reporting format in which we have integrated taxonomy for reporting cost and carbon. So if you have a new air conditioning type, then you will do a life cycle cost and carbon and energy analysis using that integrated taxonomy so that you can make a prudent decision. Maybe the decision for a particular case maybe to go lower initial cost, maybe not so efficient on energy or decarbonization, but that's at least done in a very transparent and prudent fashion if you had all the data. So cost, especially of low carbon materials, is a challenge. Knowledge and training required perhaps for some of these newer technologies is a challenge, and we need to appreciate it rather than saying that everything is fine. So to address it, obviously there are multiple things. The government is, I think Richie pointed out IRA, so in which there are investments available for deep decarbonization of important materials like cement and steel, for example. And there's a lot more that is being done. So cost is an issue, but there are ways to address it. And I think I'm not too sure if the labor shortage is going to swing one way or the other. If we decided to go into low carbon materials, it may have some impact. But I think the bigger impact would be on skills and competencies required by construction professionals to deal with these decision-making issues that will crop up on their projects and assets when we make these decisions. As Richie pointed out, means there are so many new technologies coming. Keeping sort of current with those technologies and regulations that are either proposed or in play right now is something that we all need to learn. So I think the bigger piece may be skills and competencies, but definitely labor. It's not going to help reduce the labor shortages, but I'm not sure if it's going to significantly increase labor-related issues. There may be some training challenges, but that's my view on cost and labor shortages.
Yeah. So Richie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, Anil, I totally agree with you. Let me give you an example about that geothermal that I was talking about. So so initially when we brought up the idea of geothermal for this building, they're like, oh, that's going to be expensive. Yes, it is expensive. $12 million. I'll give you the number, $12 million. But when we factor in that by changing our philosophy to use geothermal to heat air and water, then we can reduce the size of the plant that we were planning before. So we need less chillers. We don't need any boilers. It's actually a much more simple system to operate. So then the labor expenses go down, and then there's potential rebates out there from IRA, from the state, from the feds, from a lot of different organizations out there that further discount the initial cost. So when we factor all that in and consider life cycle costs, so again, most of our first cost analysis has to do with installing that technology or installing that piece of equipment. But when you factor in operations and maintenance costs, it tends to work out in a short period of time. I know many of our finance colleagues are looking at a 3-year or 5-year payback. There are a lot of times when we can show them that an equipment purchase, while more expensive up front, has a really quick payback. And once we do that, and by the way, you need to talk, when you're talking with your finance folks, you need to talk about in terms that they understand. In healthcare, I use by per patient day, but depending on what organization you work for, you could talk about per widget, you could talk about per FTE, you could talk about something that the finance team understands and can equate to, because a lot of times we in the building sector, we use our own language and it doesn't necessarily transfer very well. And so my recommendation to you is to talk their language, whatever that is. I'm not going to deny that sometimes there are some expenses that have to be borne in order to move. As an example, the organics bill that came to us, we had to buy new trash cans. We had to extend our contract with our waste hauler. There were some things to do there, but when we think about the health benefits and the benefits to the immediate communities around our buildings, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So Richie, that actually is in line with one of the questions that just came through about what are some of the hardest conversations you've had with senior leaders in terms of, getting that buy-in, right, on long-term focus versus, life cycle cost and sustainability impacts?
I can go right to the top here. So, when I first started talking about sustainability with the CEO, he's like, "So you're going to make me stop drinking my Diet Coke?" I'm like, "No, this is not what this is not about plastic bottles. It's bigger than that, right? You can drink your Diet Coke all you want, just put it in the right bin."
Yeah.
That's what I'm concerned about. But I think just getting people again to understand what we're talking about, because you throw out the word sustainability or decarbonization and people's minds go everywhere, right? And what we're trying to do with our sustainability plan is focus the discussion on some key points, key areas. And I'm going to tell you guys, it took us as a group probably 8 months to get down to 7 points of discussion in that sustainability plan, and for us to focus on that, because we are professionals and we do this stuff every day, and we were all over the place about what we wanted to talk about and where we wanted to spend our time, money, and effort. But I think that's the hardest part, just boiling sustainability or decarbonization or electrification, whatever term, ESG, whatever term you want to use, to mean certain things, and then get finite about what you're talking about. That's, for me, I believe, the hardest discussion.
Okay. Yeah. Anil, any final thoughts there? Yeah.
No, not about tough conversations, but just going back to the previous point, I use, and I'm not starting any university awards here. Boston University did, I used to live in Boston, that's why, is a publicly available case study. They built a new data science building, looks like a Jenga building, very interesting, won several awards. They went in and did geothermal wells in order to become more sustainable. So those geothermal wells definitely added to the risk profile, definitely added to the supply chain issues, because these are very interesting wells that had to be done in a very congested site. So any change that you make out of your comfort zone requires the project team and perhaps the leadership to have some tough conversations. So that's a good example, publicly available case study, you can look at it. So that's the positive bit that came out of that case study, that they adopted and achieved the results that they were looking for. Then there's another bit that they tried to do, and this is a bit dated 2-3 years ago. They could not achieve the embodied carbon savings of that building because detailed what's called environmental product declarations, or EPDs, were not available for specific plants from specific manufacturers, because of which they could not really calculate the embodied carbon reduction. So that's a positive and a slightly not so positive experience from that interesting building that was built. So I think as we take sustainability and decarbonization more holistically within our projects and assets, we will be faced with these tough conversations and these very important decisions that need to be made. You can go read about it. They did a very interesting scheduling solution also. They just got two main contractors who were capable of doing those geothermal wells to come in and do some test wells. And then they went with one who in turn then hired the other one as a subcontractor, but at least reduced the risk on the project of any schedule delays, additional costs, and so on. So, but I think there are a lot of such examples.
Yeah.
And Brett, I just want to add, we talked about that legislation, and there are many cities, states, and other areas that do not have any legislation today. But I encourage the listeners here today to start thinking about and planning for it coming to legislation near you, because we firmly believe here at University of Maryland that we can't ignore it. It's coming in some form or fashion, and what you want to be is be on the forefront and develop a plan, develop the financial package, whatever you have to do in order to prepare to be ahead of the legislation or the requirements before they get to you, because as Anil mentioned, we're talking about a lot of money in potential fines. They're calling it alternative compliance here in my state. I'm calling it a fine, right? If and if we think, I'm in healthcare, and what I don't want to do is I want to keep people out of our hospitals, and by polluting the environment in which they live, this is how I'm thinking about it also. And polluting the environment in which I live is not being a good health steward. And so recognizing that our buildings are dirty, and the emissions that we spew are harmful to people. They give them asthma. They cause other problems. Asthma is the #1 thing on this CDC list from emissions. And so when you can't breathe, that's a problem. And so that's the main reason why we're looking at it. Not only because of legislation, but again, trying to be good health stewards in the communities that we're trying to serve.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. You have to have all those big facilities, right? We'd rather folks be healthy and go to the doctor once a year than need those facilities, right?
Exactly.
Trying to be good stewards of that, absolutely. Yeah. So, any final words, Anil or Richie? And I'll do a quick wrap up. But thank you both very much for the discussion. I know I learned a lot. I hope everyone else did as well. We did have a couple of administrative questions come through before. Yes, we'll be sending out the slides via PDF along with the recording. And there was a question about future webinars. So VJ will include some information about future webinars that we're presenting, and also maybe some other materials as well, because we want everyone to be talking about this, not just us and our teams, but everyone, because as Richie said, it's coming, and being on the forefront is really where you want to be. And we're happy to have those conversations with anyone on here today. So really appreciate everyone's time, and we're right at the hour here. So I'll go ahead and wrap this up. I am going to put a survey form in the chat, so please fill that out. We want to make sure we continue to offer great webinars and partner with great folks like Anil and Richie, and we really need your feedback in order to tell us what we can do better in the future, and what topics are interesting to you, right? Please feel free to send us that as well. So without any further ado, I will stop sharing my screen, and I will say, Anil, Richie, thank you very, very much again for your time. Really appreciate it. Always good to talk to you, the two of you. And everyone else, thanks very much for participating, and we hope everyone has a great and healthy holiday season. We'll go with that as the theme for today, is healthy holidays. So take care, everyone.
Thank you.